Welcome, and thank you for joining today's webinar, where we'll be exploring how strong leadership, strategic partnerships, and coordinated strategies are vital to supporting operations in the Indo-Pacific region. Hi, I'm John Thompson. I'm the Vice President of Marketing and Communications here at Austability. Today is the second in our AUKUS Unpacked event series, facilitating vital conversations as part of our mission to foster peace and security. In our first webinar with my great friend and former colleague Robert Jennings, we spoke about the challenges facing suppliers and support providers operating in the Indo-Pacific. You can find a recording to that session on our website, www.austability.com, and please do check it out after this session today. But back to today, the Indo-Pacific region stretches from the Americas in the east to India in the west, home to more than 66 distinct US defense sites and more than 375,000 US military personnel. More broadly, the Indo-Pacific represents half the world's population, two-thirds of global GDP, four of the world's largest economies, US, China, India, and Japan, and 80% of sea trade passes through the region. Over the past few months, we've published a series of white papers looking at some of the key issues that arise for organisations operating in the region. You can find those white papers on our website at www.austability.com/white papers. Today, it's my honour to introduce another of our authors, the former Australian Brigadier, Mark Smethurst. Now retired, Mark has over 35 years of senior command experience across Australian and international theatres. He has held senior leadership roles in the ADF, NATO, and US Special Operations. His white paper is titled Effective Command in the Indo-Pacific, and I'm looking forward to unpacking it with him today. Welcome, Mark.
Thanks, JT. Great to be on the podcast and looking forward to our conversation.
Well, just before we get going, I have a quick housekeeping note to our audience this morning. Please send through any questions you have by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens. We have a team working behind the scenes. Thank you to them who will be collating those questions as we go, and we'll get to them in the second half of today's discussion. So now turning to our special guest. Mark, in getting to know you a little more, is there, this is the same question I actually asked RJ during his webinar last month. What is one thing about you that nobody else knows?
Well, JT, I thought that was coming because I listened to the podcast and heard RJ wanted to be an astronaut. I'm not that smart, but I'll share a story with you. And it was the reason I never became a free faller when I was in the Special Forces community. It was back in 1991. I was an SAS Vehicle Troop Commander. We were up in Exmouth, which is in the northwest of West Australia, doing a free fall conversion to static line course. So we were all trained as static line jumpers, and we basically used free fall canopies that were not designed to be operated as static line. So anyway, we did the conversion. I was the first out of my troop at 10,000 feet. I looked up, my parachute hadn't opened properly. I did 7 rotations. I had no communications, and you're supposed to cut away with the drill was after 3 rotations. So eventually I did. I had a good canopy. I survived. I got on the ground, and the warrant officer said, who was an instructor of mine when I was in the military academy about a decade before that, he said, "Why didn't you do the proper drills back up in the aircraft?" So 3 minutes later, I'm back on the aircraft, rigged up, jumped again, and just reconfirmed in my own mind why I never liked free fall. So, people used to say vehicle mounted was never a thing that was going to last, but the two decades we spent in Afghanistan and Iraq, I think, proved that one wrong, and it was a pretty handy capability. So that's my story anyway.
Wow, wow. Oh, gosh, how thrilling about getting back on the horse, I guess.
Absolutely,
Yeah,
absolutely. So I think that's the moral of that story is fail fast and then learn quickly.
yeah. Wow. Well, looking at your white paper now, and thank you for your contributions and insights there. Since it was published, a lot of sand has shifted. Clearly, there's the review of AUKUS that's underway at the moment, that being the key focus of the white paper and this series, particularly amid concerns from the US over US submarine fleet capacity. We've had the UK Strategic Defence Review, and of course, can't ignore what's been happening over the last 10 or 11 days and over the weekend with conflict breaking out between Israel and Iran, and now the US involvement. Given all that's been happening since your white paper came out, is there anything that you would change?
Well, I think I'd rewrite the basic tenets of it, JT, based on how rapidly the world has moved forward. As you said, things are still happening in Europe. Putin is almost doubling down on the Ukraine. Donald Trump's won the election. Um, he was touting peace in the Middle East in a very very short period of time. He's still got a ways to go on that. In fact, almost, they haven't, the US hasn't declared war, but people are calling it war now. So it's going to be very interesting to see how that's dealt with. Although some commentators in Australia have been talking about that as a big stick showing towards the region that the US is still powerful. So you know that's going to play out short, in the days, weeks, and months ahead.
Mhm.
There's been pressure on growth on defence budgets. Our defence budget in Australia is sitting at around about 2%, although projected to grow, but not at the rate that's being requested, which is 3.5 to 5%. Um, China is still banging the drum with Xi Jinping talking about the aggressive takeover of Taiwan. The activities in the South China Sea are continuing, along with the shaping and influencing that has been happening for the last decade. So there has been a lot of change. So to answer your questions, what would I change? I think I'd change the the emphasis to more talk on deterrence, and we can certainly unpack that better today. So we are providing a greater deterrence and a more secure environment in the Indo-Pacific area. On your point about the Undersecretary of Defence, Eldridge Colby, and his review on AUKUS Pillar 1, uh, I think that it makes a great headline, but it was always going to happen, a review. I don't think it's relevant to the shorter timeline of issues that we need to be able to deal with in the next few years when you consider that the US Virginia class submarines that were going to be provided to Australia was not going to happen until the early 2030s. The first SSN AUKUS submarine is not ready until the late 2030s, and in Australia until the early 2040s. So there's a lot of water to go under the bridge on this one, and I think the state of preparedness for action, action now and preparedness in the next couple of years should be the real focus. And to me, the submarine issue, is a bit of a distraction.
Okay, so it sounds rather reassuring to hear that. So we shouldn't be reading then too much doom and gloom into this review then.
Oh, listen, I think the outcome could be significant, but it's not going to affect your short-term issues about capability that need to be dealt with now. And I think where I look at it from our region, that's something that's really important. It's actually what the Secretary of Defence has been talking to his counterparts around the world about doing, is lifting capability and play your part.
Mm,
You mentioned the size of the troop deployments in the US around the Indo-Pacific area. It's huge.
mm.
No one can match that, but there is an expectation that we all play our part.
Just before we then get into the white paper, then given what's happening in the Middle East at the moment, do you see that playing an impact on security in the Indo-Pacific?
I think absolutely. I mean, who knows? Who's not knows what's going to happen, over the next period of time in terms of what the response from Iran's going to be. The US and Israel have taken a bit of a sledgehammer now. They've knocked out well, we think they've knocked out the facilities. I've heard reporting earlier today that uh, some of the materials had already been moved. So we just don't know what we don't know at present. So
Mm,
there's a lot of unknowns. Um, how Iran responds, and they almost have to respond, Is that going to be seen as enough? Is it going to be legitimate? And then what's the US going to do? So I think we just don't know what the answer is going to be, but it's going to have an effect on the region in terms of whether it's stable or not in the Middle East.
Yeah.
And then what message does that send to China and others about what happens if you mess around?
Yeah. Do you see then, so we have been seeing, I guess, over the last period of time, months, few years, a shift with the US focus from Europe into the Indo-Pacific. Do you see that from an underlying perspective, that continuing, or does this what's happened in the last few days? Is that likely to sort of slow that pivot down or that shift down?
Yeah, I think there was an expectation when Trump came back into his second term that there would be action taken in the Ukraine, and clearly that has not gone as planned. So it's almost a stalemate where Russia is being allowed to do what they want to a degree. Um, the European NATO group is strengthening their resolve, but it's not changing much about what's happening on the ground. Um, so the US they've got interest in Europe, they've got interest in the Middle East, and they're trying to push towards a greater emphasis in the Indo-Pacific region, as well as doing all of the other responsibilities. So I think it's going to be difficult. I've just come back from the Soft Week conference in Tampa. Um, the commander, General Fenton, there reinforced, his focus on the Pacific as well. And you had Secretary of Defense, U.S. Secretary of Defense Hegsworth saying the same thing. So I think they recognise the importance, and this comes to, I think, the security issue around Taiwan, and you know, is North Korea going to play a part on this? What are other actors going to play? It was interesting over the last week. We had the Indonesian president was visiting Putin. So there's still a lot of broader influence coming into our region, and there's not a lot of certainty going forward.
Yes, thank you for that. Well, if we or just before we dive into your white paper, just to those on the call today, just a reminder if you have any questions to please just pop them in the Q&A channel at the bottom of your screens, and we will get to them. To them later. So questions or observations, very welcome. This fascinating discussion with Mark Smethurst. So, Mark, now let's dive into your white paper now and start unpacking. So, I'm curious to understand. You talk about the importance of recognizing previous lessons, particularly those from other parts of the world, and you reference Afghanistan and Iraq in particular. How does that assist when it comes to operating in the Indo-Pacific region, a very different part of the world?
Well, I think the greatest mistake you can do is to relearn old lessons, and I think there are some poignant lessons that we've taken, over 2 decades of conflict uh, in the Middle East theatre that we shouldn't be forgotten. And that also goes for Australia's experience in East Timor before 9/11. And really, what jumps out to me is probably uh, the general lack of training and awareness that we had culturally, understanding the political and cultural dynamics for mission success, uh, and that really was highlighted, in our planning and our execution in both, particularly Afghanistan and Iraq. Those cultural insights, lack of communication, difficulty working with coalition partners, let alone partner forces on the ground, because we hadn't experienced combat like that really since World War II. So going into a very complex region, having a complex battle space, and was only simplified by dividing areas up where different nations worked in their own area with their own partner force. And there was not um, there was not a lot of cross communications in terms of, combined activities in battle spaces by different partners. Um, and that brings me to probably the partner force. Learning how to train a partner force, I think, is now showing dividends and helping train the Ukrainians to go back into their battle. Particularly the Brits and what they've been doing, assisting with others, New Zealand, Australia, and other countries that have been assisting with the training mission in Ukraine. And I think the other thing, and probably more relevant to our discussion today, is the difficulties of supporting those operations. The supply chains were very long. Fuel, ammunition, rations in bulk generally came by convoys out of the port of Karachi in Pakistan. Often supplies were being brought in by air, but was limited in size, obviously, and and the capabilities of each nation to look after their own supply chain. So those lessons amplify over a landlocked country. You then put that into, the Indo-Pacific area where it's not landlocked and really a sea problem is almost more difficult.
Do you see these sorts of issues being, are we learning from these mistakes? Do you see them sort of repeated, or do we have the capacity and the track record of actually learning from these past experiences?
Well, I think we learned to a certain degree. I think if we'd learnt from previous conflicts, we probably would have approached, Afghanistan and Iraq in a slightly different way, but we didn't. I know in the early days of planning in Iraq, because I was part of it, there was talk of it only being a special forces fight and going in very light and not going for and only achieving regime change and not trying to completely rebuild the country in terms of a police and military. But we seemed to do that from scratch again, and that caused its own problems. So are we good at learning lessons? Sometimes we are, sometimes we aren't. And I think at the moment we need to pay attention to this
Hmm.
and make sure we don't relearn the lessons from scratch. And we've got a good head start moving forward, because worst case, we could be having a peer-on-peer adversary, which could be very, very different to what we experienced in the Middle East.
And presumably from a commercial, the message about learning lessons from the past applies equally to the private sector, support providers like us.
Absolutely. I mean, we relied on contractors to build bases, to, do the catering, do some of the resupply. Most of those convoys that were bringing supplies in from Karachi were all civilian convoys. So
Yeah.
absolutely, there are big lessons in there in some ways, and it was highlighted, for the Australian forces in East Timor. Even, the distance between East Timor and Northern Australia, the port of Darwin, was only a day and a bit sail. That was difficult enough just to keep supplies up over that sort of distance.
And when you look at the providers and companies that are successful, have good relationships with governments, with defence forces, are they the ones that have a greater capacity to learn from past experience?
I think so, but the question I would ask, and it's probably something for more of the Q&A discussion, is do we have that capacity exercise more regularly?
Hmm.
I think the scale of activities that we do when we talk about regional engagement, which is pretty short term, or large scale exercises, it's generally done with what we've got and with a limited reliance on contractor support to do anything more permanent.
Hmm.
So the answer is probably we don't do it very well,
Hmm.
and we've got room for improvement, and we should, I think, be thinking about that in terms of the strategy as we're going forward.
You talk about the necessity for careful diplomatic engagement for support providers, contractors. It's obvious to me that very important for government to be engaging in this sort of activity. Why is it important for business to also be careful in how they engage?
Well, I think it's if we're talking about broader businesses that aren't in the region, and we're talking about companies that want to get in the region, a little bit like Austability is doing. It's hard to get in and operate independently. Normally, you've got to find a in-country partner to work with. You've got to work within the status of forces agreements. You have to work within the limitations that have been given. And if you're supporting foreign troops, whether they be US, Australian, UK, or other partners, then you've got to work within those, their own constraints and limitations. So yes, I think it can be very different. And if we look at the activities we might be discussing here, it might be just normal training activities that we're doing on an annual basis. It could be grey zone operations, which are operations short of conflict, um, where those forces coming in can't necessarily sustain themselves for that period of time. They do need external support. And I think that's a good segue into doing more of the longer term support.
And longer term support, what does that entail? What sort of time
Well,
frames?
if you look at the map you had up where you showed the distribution of US forces around the Indo-Pacific, having those forces there are sustained by not only US government contracts but US government agencies, but also external contractors supporting a lot of the basing, the food requirements, and they're liaising with local contractors as well. So I think they are very well based doing that. As we start to move into, if we expand, like I'm saying, I think we should do as part of the strategies of being more effective in the region. I think we need to be doing more of that and get comfortable in that environment.
And presumably it's more than just, having those initial discussions to set up the contracts, to set up the business relationship. It also involves a sort of a longer term relationship with with governments. From a support provider's perspective, a contractor's perspective, it's not a one-off discussion with the government to sort of seal a contract. It's just as, if not more important, to maintain an ongoing dialogue, relationship, that careful diplomatic activity.
Yeah, well, I think that's a difficulty, JT. Having those longer contracts being provided by a government that's putting its troops into the region is going to be difficult in the first place to negotiate.
Yeah.
I think very necessary if they're serious about being more persistent in that in the regions. Uh, and they need to be able to work comfortably with the various, governments and regions that they could be working with. So I don't think there is any easy answer to this.
Yeah.
I'm talking from my Australian experience here. It's very difficult to go and win a long contract, and the only example I can think of would be what we do with our embassies and our more sustained training areas, say in Papua New Guinea, or what we do in Butterworth, where we have basing. So, and that sort of reflects how the US has its footprint
Mm.
around the region as well.
And for those watching, not sure where Butterworth is. Butterworth is in northern Malaysia, up on the peninsula. Um, well, if we look at you talk about five effective strategies for teams in the Indo-Pacific, and I think we're showing a graphic here. And you talk about persistent engagement, aligning targeted engagements with counterterrorism measures, understanding what you can offer and what you cannot, anticipating climate change disruption, and status of forces agreements for grey zone operations, which you referenced before. If we look at taking each one of those five elements one at a time, and starting with persistent engagement, what is it that you mean by persistent engagement? And why is it, as you say, why is it the backbone of effective operations?
Yeah. Well, thanks, JT. in my opinion, I think it's probably the most important of the strategies that I've highlighted there. Doing a 2 week, a 1 month exercise, a port visit, doing a PASEX or passage of exercise through local borders of a country or regular flights into the South China Sea, in my opinion, doesn't cut it. Prior to 9/11, we used to work with Green Berets from US Special Operations Command who are out on training missions for 4 to 6 month periods at a time, and then they would rotate out with another force. So they would have persistent engagement in countries like Cambodia, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, and they were working there and Philippines. They were working there consistently. Um, the US still has significant numbers in Japan, Korea, and the Marines do deployments to rotating deployments through Darwin. But not having, and again, I'm talking from an Australian perspective here, having those long-term activities where you build those relationships, you understand what the dynamics are in those environments. You just don't get them by having short one-off exercises when new people come in each year. Now we do have forces that are doing more, particularly in places like Solomon Islands, Fiji, Papua New Guinea, starting to do more in Indonesia. Uh, but if those activities are only supported by defence staff and smaller groups doing longer activities, I just don't think you build up that confidence and also the knowledge unless you're in the area for sustained periods of time.
If
The,
we,
the other side of it, the other side to this discussion too, is the US can't do everything. So the US have, a strong presence throughout the region. Australia is trying to do more, and other countries are talking about doing more in the region as well, want to be more involved in the Indo-Pacific because they see it as such an important area. So I think it's also important to deconflict what's going on and make sure we're not stepping on each other's toes in multinational exercises and capacity building efforts.
earlier, you sort of referenced issues around supply chains, with Timor, East Timor, um, having that. How important is having that persistent engagement from a contractor's perspective as well?
Well, I think in some ways it's the same. I mean, if we talk about the longer term relationship we had in East Timor, we civilianized a medical contract and having had that run, uh, you know, ran that permanently, and that happened in quite early stages of East Timor. We also did that in terms of sustainment. But we don't really see that in other places unless because we're just not doing those longer term activities. If you're
Mm.
going in for 2 weeks or a month, you can generally take almost all the supplies you need, and therefore you don't need civilian contracting support.
Hmm. Well, if we look at then you talk about aligning targeted engagement with counterterrorism measures. Why is that important?
Well, I think if we reflect on what's just happened over the weekend with the destruction of the nuclear facilities in Iran, that is probably going to heighten this space even more.
Mm.
And there has been, I think, a pretty strong linkage between, if we're talking federal police and regional authorities, that's been pretty good over the last couple of decades, and it's getting stronger. But that intelligence sharing, that whether it be Five Eyes and then more broader across the coalition intelligence community, is always going to be difficult. And whether you're dealing with criminal networks or counterterrorism networks, the processes in some ways are pretty much the same. And if we've got to deal with Australian hostages in a country within the Indo-Pacific area, you just don't go in and conduct an activity just because your people are being taken. You don't have primacy, so you've got to understand the capabilities of those countries. You've got to have a close working relationship so you can go in there, at least offer advice and support. Uh, And if you don't have those relationships and if they're not exercised regularly, it makes it more difficult.
How does the support of contractors and private business in the national security sphere? How are there how are the gaps? Are there gaps in that area? Is there more support that the contractors can provide governments, security forces to be able to, assist in that space, in that counterterrorism, national security space?
I think there's probably a number of answers to that question, and it relates to, I think, the intelligence organizations using the business connectivity that's out there in the region more than they do now, because there is a lot of intelligence out there just by the fact that many companies, and I'm sure there are people on the dialed in today who operate very comfortably in the region, understand what the threats are. You've got companies like International SOS that do evacuations throughout the region as well as providing medical support. So they understand the system, they understand the networks, how to move people around quickly and assist in an emergency. So I think that's one part of it. Can they
Hmm.
assist more strongly? Well, there are intelligence organizations around that could probably be utilized more than what they are. I think that becomes more difficult the more classified you are dealing with. But I think it's probably more about, coming back to my original point, it's probably more about using the ecosystem of like-minded organizations that want to assist and they want to also look after their own people.
Yeah.
I mean, I look towards the call for evacuation of Australian citizens in Iran over the weekend. Well, the US had made that call a couple of weeks ago, and by the time the call was made, there was all the air options had been closed. So I think this is about what you can do in a more proactive environment
Mm.
to not get caught when you shouldn't be caught.
Yeah. Yeah. Very good point. Very good point. Well, if you look at the third strategy that you outline, it makes sense to understand that you need to understand what you can offer, and also what you can't offer, particularly as a provider. What are the dangers of getting it wrong, not being across what you can and what you cannot offer, and potentially sort of offering the world and not being able to deliver? What are the dangers? What are the risks there?
Well, I think that the key risk is if you're off the world and don't deliver, you'll only be used once and they probably won't come back to you.
Yeah.
Um, it's about understanding realistically what the requirements are. So I think the onus is on, the military to a certain degree to articulate what their requirements are so it makes it easy to understand. I've only had this discussion with a few people recently. You can't expect people to second guess what the requirements are. You've got to help them with those requirements. Normally, when you go into a combat area, those requirements and contracts are pretty easily understood and they happen quickly. And there is an expectation there'll be a ramp up quickly. And of course, that ramp up comes at a cost. If there's more of a persistent engagement, I think the ability to understand what those support requirements are, come up with plans to expand what they could be, is far more easier to understand.
Yes, that aspect around persistent engagement. I often hear sort of the frustration from companies about being brought into a conversation towards the end of it, rather than at the beginning, uh, when opportunities are being explored, needs are being understood. And yes, I wonder what it's like on the other side, on the military side, why those conversations aren't necessarily had with industry sort of earlier on in the conversation, rather than waiting till, towards the end. Because I wonder whether you would get a better outcome if there was it seems to me there'd be better understanding of what the issues are, what the needs are, who can deliver, how they can deliver, all of that. So you end up with a better result at the end. Do you see, is that sort of is that felt as well, on the military side of things, the fact that we bring our partners in sometimes a bit too late, or that's not really something
I
that's
think I think
recognised?
you could almost talk about it like in a disaster management situation where, if you have a cyclone or a typhoon comes in or a hurricane and destroys an area,
Yeah.
the impact is really quick. The rebuild and getting things moving again can take years, if not decades. So the same goes in my mind to if you're going to conduct a military operation and you're doing it, in a very quick timeline, and you're not taking people on the journey, as in to be prepared. And I don't want to be naive and say that, every operation should be like that because
Yeah.
sometimes they're going to move very, very quickly. But if you create a humanitarian disaster with what you're doing and you're not prepared for it and you're playing catch up, it's not going to get better.
Mm.
It's probably going to get worse. So I think your introduction to this question was bang on the money. There is a lot of things to be done on both sides, but ultimately it's going to be government and military being prepared to have those discussions about how do you support in an area, how do you work in a country you're not familiar with? Are you prepared to go and work with companies that do have that experience and then can leverage off the local capability, which is going to make the governments you're dealing with much more happier that you're doing that. It's like a build in America policy or build in Australia policy or the UK.
Yeah.
If you do it properly and the locals benefit from doing that at the same time, you're going to have a um, far more successful way of conducting business.
And that was actually going to leads nicely into my next question, which was how important is it to engage those local supply chains?
Well, I think you've got no choice. I mean, I
Mm.
remember almost all of the forward operating bases that I went to on my last tour of Afghanistan when I was running NATO Special Forces. It was all locally engaged staff there, supported by, a few contractors who weren't local nationals. So you just can't operate without them. You can't
Mm.
afford to bring those people in. You can't afford the prices or the cost of that labor. And you need to reserve that to other more priority type activities. So your support, your sustainment, your lodgings, um, all of those activities are generally going to have to be done by locally employed staff, supported by an external contractor who you've got that trust with. And they're
Mm.
going to have to be vetted, and it's going to be an ongoing engagement.
It's interesting, you echo exactly the same thoughts as RJ in his webinar, and for those part of today's conversation, RJ goes into a lot more detail about the hows and the whys in terms of engaging those local supply chains. Um, but if now, Mark, if we turn to the fourth strategy, around the impacts and the effects of climate change. It's a fascinating point. It's been part of the conversation for many years now. Is this happening in terms of companies, governments anticipating the future disruption of climate change? And so is that happening? And if not, why not?
Well, I think this is always a difficult one because you've got your climate change deniers and you've got those
Mhm.
that believe it's happening, and then you've got the reality of what's happening on the ground. And rising sea waters is a slow moving issue, but then the effects of tsunamis, cyclones that can be absolutely devastating and take hundreds of thousands of lives. Is I mean, we saw that in 2004 tsunami. But those activities are not something we're generally good at preparing for. We had a mudslide in Papua New Guinea last year, killing hundreds of people. At the time, we thought it was thousands. It was unknown. Everyone's got a response capability. Whether it's going to be enough depends on the size of disaster, and no country can prepare for a massive disaster and have that capability. So it really is about how quickly you can respond and build the teams. the US are very good at moving an aircraft to carry around with a Marine Expeditionary Unit in there, and if they happen to be in the right place, can go and support very quickly. But there are not a lot of other countries that can go and do that. So I think this is very much, these are arrangements that need to be in place. They're generally being rehearsed domestically, and then that they can be exported when necessary, and they
Hmm.
can be used to augment in-country responses that already might be there. So I think there is this obviously the sensitivity of who is the lead, who's going to be, can the country that's been affected actually look after themselves? Are they willing to take support? Are they willing to cede command of that support? Sometimes not. So I think it's a very complex issue.
Yeah.
One thing's for certain is it's not going away. And based on current trends, it's going to get worse. And it's part of more broadly our response in the region, because if we can be seen to be, all of us, be a good partner and move quickly and assist communities at need when disasters strike, then that's all part of building relationships, and that also goes towards a persistent engagement.
How do you see the business response to these sort of climate changes? Is from your experience, are they adapting? Are they changing? Are they doing it quick enough? How do you
I,
see the
I,
business?
I don't, JT, I don't claim to be an expert in the region, but if you
Mhm.
look at just basic uh, basic actions to get people's feet or get their lives back to normal in terms of water purification, temporary accommodation, rebuilding villages and cities. Most people, I mean, Western worlds don't have that capability to do it when there is a bushfire or a cyclone wipes out a town, and
Mm.
it takes time. So when you talk about more remote areas, it becomes more difficult. Are private enterprise in a better position to assist? I think to a degree they are. And generally, most countries understand what their capabilities are, but they're not necessarily held on a short string to move and contracted to provide that support. Now, I think it goes to being more operationally prepared. If you're serious about the way you're going to respond, you've probably got them on a shorter string, and to do that, you've got to pay for it.
Mhm. Thanks. Just before we get to that final strategy, I just wanted to remind our viewers that if you have any questions or observations, please jot them down in the Q&A bar down below at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to them very shortly. Um, so, Mark, just the final strategy to have a look at is just the value of establishing status of forces agreements for grey zone operations. And my question is, how does it impact businesses like ours, a support logistics provider like ours?
Mm. Well, I think this comes back really to the first point, and I've spoken about grey zone operations earlier.
Mhm.
So it very much is linked to the strategy of persistent engagement. If you're going to do persistent engagement properly, you're going to be conducting grey zone operations. So you're going to be working in an environment that is not at war. It sits between peace and open conflict. So it requires a very careful blend between military, diplomatic, and economic strategies. So if you don't have that business partnership up front, and you're conducting those operations in more of a heightened way to what's occurring now, because I don't think we've got it right now. I think there needs to be an expansion of those cooperative activities, and having those agreements in place with either third country providers or companies that are experts in doing the support, so that you can scale up and scale down depending on the activities that are being conducted, then I think we've got a ways to go.
Thank you, Mark. Really appreciate your time this morning and the opportunity to discuss your white paper, and to our viewers. If you haven't read Mark's white paper, I commend it to you. You can access it through our website, www.austability.com/white papers. So now turning to some Q&As, we've had if you do have questions or observations, again, just in the chat Q&A chat at the bottom of your screen. We've had a question from Wolfgang Dempsey looking at just referring to the first points, the first part of the discussion today around the AUKUS agreement, and he talks about considering the extended timescales for delivery and commissioning. Is the nuclear submarine, so Pillar One of AUKUS, expected to be, in your view, an effective delivery platform or intelligence gathering tool? And delivery platform, weapons delivery platform. Do you have any views on that?
Well, I do, and certainly, according to reports, so they were pretty effective with the launching of missiles for the raid over the weekend by the US. The real issue, I think, from an Australian perspective, is AUKUS is not going to deliver for a number of decades. So there is a waiting game here. Will it be effective when it's in place? I think submarines they form a part of a more broader response between what we've got up in space, what we're doing subsea. What I am seeing a lot of at the moment is uh, a real growth in subsea intelligence collection capability. So I think of fast jets having a lower wingman. There's been plenty of discussions of submarines doing the same thing. So they've got capabilities out in front of them, doing the scanning, looking at the threats, putting an unmanned capability at risk rather than a submarine. So I think it's one piece. It's a very important piece when you talk about having a deterrence and having a forward deployed capability that can launch a response if required. So to me, a very critical part of deterrence. Unfortunately, from an Australian perspective, we've got a ways to go. So we need to be doing similar sorts of things in the air and on land in our region if we are to provide an adequate deterrence in terms of intelligence collection and also developing long range missile capability, which has been declared by the Australian government that they're doing that. But having them in Australia with the ranges that they've got is not going to cut it. It means we've got to deploy them forward. So they can be on surface ships, they can be in the air, but that's problematic as well. So we probably have to have those areas that we can operate from with partner nations participating with us.
Just taking a broader look at that deterrence piece, and the sort of region wide. So you talk about Australia and its capability. Are we doing more broadly? So beyond just Australia, are we doing enough in that deterrence space?
Well, we've got an exercise starting next month called Talisman Sabre. It's one of the largest military exercises that Australia works in partnership with the US. I mean, that starts middle of July. It runs for about 3 weeks. You've got partner nations from Canada, Fiji, France, Germany, India, Indonesia, Japan, Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, Papua New Guinea, Philippines, Korea, Singapore, Thailand, Tonga.
Hmm.
The United Kingdom's playing. Brunei, Malaysia, and Vietnam are also attending as observers. So it's a massive activity. 19 nations playing there, but they're working either in training areas off the coast or on mainland Australia or in Papua New Guinea. So you look at the wider area, could you run a more complex activity? Could you be running more of a grey zone type, permanent type exercise or operation? Um, there are probably those activities happening anyway, but I doubt at that sort of scale. So can we improve and do more? I think the door's really wide open to do more. That's pretty expensive and it's going to take a lot of buy-in. And I named a number of European, US, Canada countries playing there. some of those countries will be distracted with what's happening in Europe and the Middle East as well.
I've been
So I
to
think it's really important to gather the capabilities within the region, exercise them, be familiar, and continue that more than 3 weeks every 2 years.
I've been to several conferences over the last few months in Europe and the US, and at all of them they talk about the importance of partnerships and sort of feeding on from what you're talking about with Talisman Sabre. Is there a role for business contractors, defense contractors to, I don't know, have some sort of an observer role or place play some sort of a role in some of these exercises, RIMPAC in Hawaii, um, to help deepen that understanding about what's happening, so that ultimately you get to a win-win situation where there's understanding on both sides, so that when the need arises, you can very quickly come together in partnership, um, to be able to deliver the services that are required. Is there a role for business in some of these exercises?
I I certainly think you're right. There is a role for them. Whether it would be something like the Talisman Sabre exercise I just mentioned is probably questionable because it's no doubt too short and too difficult and costly to organise something for such a short period. But there'd be nothing wrong with doing desktop exercises, contingency planning to actually understand what the requirements are, what the limitations are. So there is that two-way conversation that I think you're alluding to
Yeah.
about how we could improve that response. Then that could be built on through a larger level of persistent engagement by doing activities and supporting people. So what you're really trying to do is I think you have the mechanisms in place, and then you're just building on what you've got as you start to move towards something that could be more serious.
And then that takes me to one of my final questions is how can the military and private sector teams better collaborate to ensure reliable logistics and supply chains in the Indo-Pacific region?
Well, I think we've probably really covered that during the discussion, but I think they just need to be brought in early in the process. They need to be part of the solution in training and persistent engagement. If we're going to fight peer or near peer, it's going to be a lot more difficult than something in the Middle East because they weren't peer or near peer.
Mhm.
So it's going to be a lot more difficult. And something we haven't really discussed today is the risk to those organisations is going to be far greater if we go into a near peer or near peer engagement.
Is there, before we wrap up, Mark, is there anything else that we haven't covered that you think in terms of um, the operating in the Indo-Pacific region with the AUKUS alliance, surrounded by the AUKUS alliance, and all that entails? Are there any final messages that you would have?
I think the point I'd probably reinforce is I've not been trying to have a dig at any government or capability. I remember in the 90s we were doing great engagement within the region. It sort of culminated with East Timor. And it was only through engagement activities that I think that actually went relatively smoothly. The the fight in the Middle East area of operations was in some ways a distraction. People have got used to short exercises and not long-term activities. So that is a difficult change for a lot of people to move to. So I think when we start talking about the Indo-Pacific area, it's a massive piece of geography. It's complex in its own right by the fact that it's generally, a lot of water, little land, and and access to areas and sea trade can be stopped relatively easily. through a number of choke points. So I think it requires the broader coalition to be doing a lot more to support each other rather than taking independent or thinking independently. And really, I'm probably talking more about what the US as the largest partner can do to leverage more effectively in the region, and therefore, when we're um, enhancing our capability and spending more time in the area, how do we bring industry on board to assist with that? And that could be anything from normal logistic transportation, moving troops around by air and by sea, by supporting them on the ground, by establishing base camps, forward operating bases, or having contingency plans ready to go so they can move rapidly. I think if we can do that, and I really like the issue you raised about having more of those discussions and being able to get industry in a room to move that forward with the uniform and the government types, so they understand actually what they're looking at, and that could start with humanitarian support operations.
Well, thank you, Mark. We do appreciate your time, your insights, fascinating discussion this morning, and I guess it brings us nicely to a circle, closes the loop when we think about, the importance of the region with 80% of the world's trade passing through the Indo-Pacific. So sadly, we are out of time, and thank you again for contributing to what I hope to all our viewers was a valuable and informative session today. As a reminder, this is the concluding session in our series of AUKUS Unpacked online events. So if you've enjoyed today, please keep an eye out on our LinkedIn page for future event announcements. If you'd like a free copy of any of our white papers, I encourage you to go to www.austability.com/white papers, where you'll also find links to view the previous webinar in the series. A copy of this webinar will be published in the next couple of days. Finally, thanks to all those who made today possible, our white paper authors, including Mark, our researchers, graphic designers, and the team at Ambition PR. And thank you, Mark, for being so generous with your time today. To you, our viewers, for being part of today's webinar. At Austability, we have 13 worldwide offices and a strong presence in the Indo-Pacific. So if there's anything that you'd like to know more about or need support in your own mission, please do not hesitate to get in touch by emailing info@austability.com or me at john.thompson@austability.com. I hope you have a lovely rest of the morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever in the world you are. And again, thank you and goodbye.